Yeah, I come on too early, but oh well. All right, let's get started. Let's start it off. Here we go. Colonialism as a prop to metropolitan economies and capitalism as a system. Metropolitan places would be the town centers that, like, of the capitalist nations and stuff like that. The composition of Unilever should serve as a warning that colonialism was not simply a matter of ties between a given colony and its mother country, but between colonies on the one hand and the metropoles on the other. The German capital in, hold on a second. The German capital in Unilever's joined, the German capital in, why am I messing this up? Okay. And Unilever joined the British in exploiting Africa and the Dutch in exploiting the West Indies. The rewards spread through the capitalist systems in such a way that even those capitalist nations who were not colonial powers were also beneficiaries of the spoils. Unilever factories established in Switzerland, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States were participants in the expropriation of Africa's surplus and in using that surplus for their own development. Germany always had a stake in colonial Africa, even after 1918, when the other capitalist powers deprived Germany of its colonies. German shipping revived in the 1920s and played an active role in East, West, and South Africa. German financial houses also had contacts with Africa, the most direct being the Twinjet Bank, the Twinjet, it's German bank in East Africa. Dutch shipping companies were involved with the German and British in the West African Conference Line, while the Scandinavian shippers were noted for the hiring out of, quote, tramp, end quote, ship, which freighted cargo between Africa and Europe outside of the scheduled lines. The old East African Trading Company was supported by Danish capital, and the Swiss had no colonies in Africa, but they had substantial capital in SCOA. They played a key role in imperialist banking, and they kept out of the wars fought by other capitalists so that they could still continue to trade with both sides and thereby acquiring colonial produce. Then there was Japan, a capitalist/imperialist power with colonies in Asia, and with the keen interest in trade with Africa, Japanese capitalists tried to undersell their European counterparts, but the trade they conducted with Africa was still unequal and disadvantageous to the Africans. To fully understand the colonial period, it is necessary to think in terms of the economic partition of Africa. Unlike the political partition of the 19th century, the economic partition had no fixed or visible boundaries. It consisted of the proportions in which capitalist powers divided up among themselves the monetary and non-monetary gains from colonial Africa. For instance, Portugal had two large political colonies in southern Africa. But economically, Mozambique and Angola were divided among several capitalist powers, which were invented by the Portuguese government because Portuguese capitalists were too weak to handle those vast territories. Congo and South Africa had their own special arrangements of economic partitions, both of them being valuable territories. At first, Congo was designated the, quote, Congo Free State, end quote, under King Leopold II of Belgium. That meant that it was to have been a free trade zone and an area open to investment investment by the capitalists of all nationalities. To practice, Leopold used administrative devices to monopolize the wealth of Congo, and that was one of the principal reasons the international capitalist community moved against Leopold in 1908. When Belgium took over the administration of the Congo, it also ensured that most of the surplus and other benefits would accrue to Belgium. However, non-Belgian capitalist interests were able to penetrate through investment in mining and, as a colonial period, advanced the British, French, and Americans, but cut bigger prices of the Congo cake. For a long while, South Africa was the most important raw material reservoir for the whole of imperialism. Britain was the European power, which had already been entrenched in South Africa for many years when gold and diamonds were discovered in the 19th century. On the eve of the scramble, Britain had to come to terms with the Boer settlers, whose livelihood then came primarily from the land, and whose main interest was to see the exploitation and domination of the African population and other groups of non-white immigrants. Therefore, the economic and political partition of Africa gave Britain the lion's share of the mineral wealth, while the Boers retained the political power necessary to institutionalize white racism. Boers were white farmers in African countries. Hello. As capitalists of other... Let me make sure no one else said hello. Well, welcome back, by the way. Kevin, I don't know if Kevin's still here. Hi. All right, here we go. As capitalists of other nationalities entered into relationship with South Africa through investments and trade, those capitalists agreed to strengthen and did the racist/fascist social relations in South Africa. Economic partition and repartition of Africa was going on all the time because the proportion of the soil that went to different capitalist countries kept changing. Special mention must be made of the United States because its share of the benefits from Africa was constantly increasing throughout the colonial period. As time went on, the United States got an even bigger slice of the unequal trade between metropoles and colonial Africa. The share of the U.S. in Africa's trade rose from just over $28 million in 1913 to $150 million in 1932 and to $1.2 billion in 1948. At which figure it represented nearly 15% of African foreign trade. The share of the USA in West Africa's trade rose from $38 million in 1932 to $163 million in 1946 and to $517 million in 1954. However, it was South Africa which was America's best trading partner in Africa, supplying her with gold, diamonds, manganese, and other minerals, and buying heavy machinery in turn. Apart from direct U.S.-South African trade, most of South Africa's gold was resold in London to American buyers, just as most Gold Coast Nigerian cocoa was resold to the USA. Intercontinental trade brought out the need for shipping services and America did not leave those in the hands of capitalists of other nations. James Farrell, president of the United States Steel Export Company, acquired a shipping line to Africa because of his, quote, belief in the future of the dark continent, end quote. Ew. Officials of the UAC had said exactly the same thing, and it is obviously that they, like them, Farrell meant the bright future of metropolitan capitalism and exploiting Africa. It is always best when these individuals speak for themselves. Vice Admiral Cochrane of the United States Navy was a great admirer of Farrell's shipping lines. In 1959, he wrote an introduction to a study of Farrell's operations and said, here we go, this is what he said: "We read this stiff international competition to assure the supply of strategic materials for our current industrial military economy. Farrell's line is making American maritime history. It is demonstrating clearly, emphatically that ships wearing the flag of a nation do in fact stimulate the commerce of that nation, demonstrating the values of the American flag ocean commerce to the health and wealth of the United States." United States capitalists did not confine themselves to mere trade with Africa, but they also acquired considerable assets within the colonies. It is common knowledge that Liberia was an American colony in everything but name. The United States supposedly aided the Liberian government with loans, but used the opportunity to take over Liberian custom revenue to plunder thousands of square miles of Liberian land, and generally to dictate the weak government of Liberia. The main investment in Liberia was undertaken by Firestone Rubber Company. Firestone made such huge profits from Liberian rubber that it was the subject of rubber out of Liberia. In return, the Liberian government received $8 million. In earlier years, the percentage of the value that went in return, the Liberian government received $8 million. In earlier years, the percentage of the value that went to the Liberian government was much smaller, but at the best of times, the average net profit to the Liberian government was much smaller, but at the best of times, the average net profit made by Firestone was 3 times the Liberian revenue. And yet, the non-monetary benefits to the United States capitalist economy were worth far more than the money returns. Vice Admiral Cochrane, in the quotation above, went to the heart of the matter when he mentioned strategic raw materials for the functioning of the industrial military machine of the American imperialist. Firestone acquired its Liberian plantation precisely because Britain and Holland had been raising the price of rubber which came from their Asian colonies in Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, respectively. In Liberia, the United States rubber industry obtained a source that was reliable in peace and war, one that was cheap and entirely under American control. One of the rubber's most immediate connections was with the automobile industry, and so it is not surprising that Harvey Firestone was a great friend and a business colleague of Henry Ford. Liberian rubber turned the town of Akron, Ohio, into a powerful rubber tire manufacturing center, and the tires went over to the even bigger automobile works of Ford in Detroit. American investment in Africa during the last 15 years of colonialism was in some ways at the expense of the actual colonized powers, and yet ultimately it was in the interest of Western European capitalism. This paradox is explained by noting that the United States had become the world's leading capitalist imperialist powers by the outbreak of the Second World War. It possessed the colonies of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, but much more important were its imperialistic investments throughout Latin America and to the lesser extent in Asia and Africa. America's foreign investment in the 1930s drew slightly ahead of those in Britain, which were a long way ahead of the imperialist outlay of France, Germany, and Japan. In 1939 and 45, war tremendously accelerated the changeover in America's favor. Europe suffered staggering losses, but no battles were fought on American soil, and so its productive capacity expanded. Therefore, after 1945, American capital moved into Africa, Asia, and Europe itself with new aggressiveness and confidence due to the fact that other capitalist competitors were still lying on the ground. In 1949, both British and French bankers had no choice but to invite American financier into the African continent, for the French and British had insufficient capital of their own. The United States controlled international banks for reconstructions, and development became an important vehicle for American influence in Africa and one of the tools for economic repartition of the continent. Research by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah revealed that direct private investments by Americans in Africa increased between 1945 and 1958 from about $110 million to $789 million, most of it drawn from profits. Official estimates of profit made by the United States company from front 1946 to 1959 in Africa are put at $1,234,000,000. In considering the question of economic partition, what is relevant to the rate of growth of United States investments and profits compared to those of Britain, France, Belgium, for instance, the American investment in 1951 was $313 million, which was nearly 3 times what it was 5 years earlier. And in the subsequent 5 years, the investment went up 2.5 times. Meanwhile, British and French investment increased more slowly. However, while the United States was edging out the other colonialists, they all stood to gain from the advance made within North American capitalist economy in terms of science, technology, organization, and military power. As pointed out earlier, when the African colony contributed to the European metallurgical industries or to its electrical industries, that contributions passed into other aspects of the society because the sector concerned were playing leading roles within the capitalist economy. Similarly, the United States was a geographical area that was in the forefront of capitalist development. For instance, its technological know-how passed into West European hands by way of a series of legal devices such as patents. Furthermore, because the United States was by then the world's leading capitalist state, it also had to assume active responsibility for maintaining the capitalist imperialist structure in all its economic, political, and military aspects. After the war, the United States moved into Western Europe and Japan, both to establish its own stronghold and at the same time to give a blood transfusion to capitalism in those areas. A lot of the blood was definitely African. It is not just that America made relatively safe profits out of Africa in the 19th century and in the earlier 20th century, but above all, it must be recalled that North America was that part of the European capitalist system which had been the most direct beneficiary of the massacres of the indigenous people in America and the enslavement of Africans. The continued exploitation of African peoples within its own boundaries and in the Caribbean, the Latin America, must also be cited as evidence against American monster imperialism. The United States was a worthy successor of Britain as the leading force of policemen and the imperialist/colonialist world from the 1945 onward. Under the Marshall Plan, by which the United States capitalism aided Western European capitalism after the last war, it was announced that American experts were exploring Africa from end to end for agricultural and mineral wealth, especially the latter. Marshall Plan money through the Economic Commission of Africa went to firms like the mines of De Zeldengia, which mined lead and zinc in North Africa, and at the same time the money allowed Americans to buy controlling shares in the company. Thus, in 1954, Morgan of the United States shared with the Rothschilds of Europe most of the net profit of 1,250,000,000 francs, old francs, $1.16 million made by the mine de Zeldeja in that year. Similarly, the Belgian government received a substantial aid from the United States to implement a 10-year economic program in the Congo from 1950 to 1959, and as the economic program in the Congo, and as the price of the aid, United States United States monopolies established control over some companies in the Congo. The USA took second place after Belgium in the Congo's foreign trade, and the United States capitalists had to be granted a range of privileges. So the paradox continued, whereby the United States capitalists intruded and elbowed out French, British, and Belgian capitalists in colonial Africa, while providing the funds without which the Western European nations could not have revived and could not have increased their exploitation of Africa, which is what they did in the period of 1945 to 60. Over that last few decades, of colonialism, colonial possessions served capitalism as a safety valve in times of crisis. The first major occasion when this was displayed was during the Great Economic Depression of 1929 to 34. During that period, forced labor was increased in Africa, and the prices paid to Africans for their crops were reduced. Workers were paid less, and imported goods cost a great deal more. That was the time when workers in the metropolitan countries also suffered terribly, but the colonialists did the best they could to transfer the burdens of the Depression away from Europe and on to the colonies. The Great Economic Depression did not affect the Soviet Union, where socialism caused great development, but the slum spread from one end of the capitalist system to the other. It was the product of a irrationality of the capitalist mode of production. The search for profit caused production to run ahead of people's capacity to purchase. Ultimately, both production and employment had to be drastically reduced. Africans had nothing to do with the inherent shortcomings of capitalism, but when Europeans were in a mess, they had no scruples about intensifying the exploitation of Africa. The economic depression was not a situation from which Britain could benefit at the expense of Sweden, or where Belgium could gain at the expense of the United States. They were all drowning, and that was why the benefit of the colonies saved not only the colonized powers, but all capitalist nations. So again, the Global South saving the day through being highly exploited. The second major occasion on which the colonies had to bail out the metropoles was during the last World War. As noted earlier, the African people were required to make huge sacrifices and to supply vital raw materials at little cost to the metropoles. Africa's military importance was also deceived. Not only did Africans fight and die on various battlefields of the war, but the continent held a key strategic position. In November 1942, a third front was opened in Africa, following the European and Asian fronts, and that front was the means of final victory. Accidents of geography meant that Africa controlled communications in the Mediterranean and in South Atlantic, and it commanded the two western entrances into the Indian Ocean. As one military analyst put it, quote, "The side that held Africa was on the way to final victory," end quote. With the aid of African fighting men and resources, the major colonial powers maintained control of the continent in the face of attacks by the Italians, who had only Libya, Somaliland, and briefly Ethiopia. The Germans, of course, by then had no colonies in Africa, and they had to use what was offered by the Italians and fascist Vichy Frenchmen. Unlike the First World War, the Second World War was not simply one between capitalist powers. The aggressor states of Italy, Germany, and Japan were fascist. The governments of Portugal, Spain, and South Africa also subscribed to ideology, although for opportunist reasons, both the Portuguese and South African Boers, which are the white farmers, found it more convenient to ally with Britain, France, and United States, and other bourgeoisie democracies. Fascism is a deformity of capitalism. It heightens the imperialist tendencies towards domination which is inherent in capitalism, and it safeguards a principle of private property. At the same time, fascism immeasurably strengthens the institutional racism already bred by capitalism. Rather it be against Jewish people, as in Schmittler's case, or against African people, in the case of ideology of Portugal, Salazar, and the leaders of South Africa. Fascism reverses the political gains of bourgeoisie democratic systems such as free elections, equality before the law, and parliaments. It also extols authoritarianism and the reactionary unions of the church with the state. In Portugal and Spain, it was the Catholic Church. In South Africa, it was the Dutch Reformed Church. Like its progenitors of capitalism, fascism is totally opposed to socialism. Fascist Germany and Italy attacked both the other capitalist states and the Soviet Union, which was still the only socialist state in the world by 1939. The defeat of fascism was therefore the victory for socialism, and at the same time it preserved the other capitalist nations from having to take the historical retrograde step of fascism. When the last World War ended, Africa's further role was to help Europe reconstruct, and that crises the United States played a major part as has just been mentioned. But the colonizing nations also had direct recourse of their colonies in spite of shortage of capital. It is noteworthy that European capitalism from the late 1940s onward recognized Africa's potential as a savior of their own war-torn economies, and they openly made statements that to that effect. It was in 1946 that the Ministry of the Colonies in the French cabinet was renamed the Ministry of Overseas France, and that colonized Africans were enthusiastically I'm going to make sure this is an enthusiastic. I'm going to make sure. Oh my gosh. Hopefully the internet's going fast. And it looks like it is. Maybe not. A little faster than yesterday. I hope I'm not getting any lag. EM. There it is. No lag, thank you. Come on. Please let me say it. Euphemistically, sorry. Africans were euphemistically called, quote, overseas Frenchmen, end quote. About that time, a statement from a French Ministry of Education frankly admitted that, and here's what they said, France would be only a little state of Europe without the 75 million overseas Frenchmen whose young force has revealed itself to the world in such a remarkable manner, referring to Africans' role in the war. That's what they're referring to. Shortly after, when France prepared its 4-year plan for 1949 to 52, statements such as the following were to be encountered. Uncountered. Morocco will take an active part in the recovery of France by supplying manganese, cobalt, and lead ore, canned goods, and agriculture produce. So again, they're calling on, they're calling on their colonies to get them out of their shit, of their hole that they put on. Oh my gosh, wild. At the end of the last war, both Britain and France set up agencies for the development, quote unquote, of their colonies. In the British spheres, this was known as the Colonial Development of Welfare, CD and W, while the French fund was known as the FIDES, FIDES, I don't know. Their principal functions was to provide loans, the purpose of which was to help the colonies to help the metropoles. In other words, the crisis of post-war reconstruction required that even greater efforts should be made to maximize the resources of colonies. It was no ordinary post-war crisis which Western Europe faced in the 1940s and 1950s. The bourgeoisie had to rebuild capitalist states at a time when socialism had already proved itself in the Soviet Union, and in the period when the Red Army of the Soviets had aided groups of socialists to come to power in Eastern Europe. This was the greatest challenge ever to be faced with the bourgeoisie, because unlike fascism, socialism threatened the basic capitalist principles of private ownership of the means of production. Furthermore, socialist principles were making their presence felt even in remote corners of the colonies, and the capitalists realized the necessity for cutting the colonies off from socialist thought, as well as using colonial resources to stave off what they termed, quote, the threat of communism, end quote, the scepter of communism, the ghost of communism. The scepter is in the capitalist struggles to keep off the challenge of socialism. It is as a complete mode of production in a way of life. Africa played at least two key roles. One being to provide bases for the capitalist militarists, and the other being to provide a wide range of raw materials essential for modern armament industries. The most vital of These raw materials were uranium and other radioactive substances for atomic and later nuclear weapons, including the hydrogen bomb, almost rivaling uranium in importance were certain raw minerals like lithium from Rhodesia needed for the special steel that went into new aircraft rockets, tanks, guns, and bombs. Colonial powers already had small military establishments in each colony, and right up to the end of the colonial era, it was considered necessary to strengthen those. For instance, in 1955 French budget, there was a special vote for 6 billion francs, $16.8 million, for the improvement of military installations in the colonies, and notably for strategic bases in Dakar and Djibouti. It's Djibouti. It's Djibouti. Sometime previously, the Belgians had completed a huge air base near Kuma in the Congo, adding to the regular bases in long-established colonies. The imperialist powers were able to set up military installations in African territories, which fell into the hands during the war. In this context, the United States was particularly important because it was already the principal buttress of the capitalist defense system in the form of North Atlantic Treasury Organization, NATO, thus altered helping to recapture North Africa from the fascists. The United States was able to build major air force bases in Morocco and Libya, the Italian Eritrea. The Americans stepped in with modern radar stations and Ethiopian conceded military bases. Through nominally independent Liberia had little option but to accept the massive military presence of Americans as a logical consequence of America's economic exploitation and domination in Liberia. When the United States agreed to build ports in Monrovia in 1943, they also obtained the concession that the United States was to have, quote, the right to establish, use, maintain, and control such naval, air, and military facilities and installations at the site of the port and in general vicinity thereof, as may be desired for the protection of the strategic interests of the United States in the South Atlantic, end quote. Throughout the war, Liberia's Robertsfield airfield had been of considerable value to the United States, and later on it continued to have a military utility. To tie matters off further, the United States entered into what is called a military assistance pact with Liberia in 1951. Needless to say, in the 1950s, when most Africans were still colonial subjects, they had absolutely no control over the utilization of their soil for militaristic ends. Virtually the whole of North Africa was turned into a sphere of operations for NATO, with bases aimed at the Soviet Union. There could easily have developed a nuclear war without African peoples having any knowledge of the matter. The colonial powers actually held military conferences in African cities like Dakar and Nairobi in the early 1950s, inviting the whites of South Africa and Rhodesia and the governments of the United States. Time and time again, the evidence pointed to a cynical use of Africa to buttress capitalism economically and militarily, and therefore, in effect, forcing Africa to contribute to its own exploitation. Apart from saving capitalism in times of crisis, the dependency had always been prolonged the life of capitalism by taking the edge off the internal contradictions and conflicts which were a part of the capitalist system. The principal contradictions within capitalism from the outset was that between the capitalists and the workers. To keep their system going, the capitalists had constantly to step up the rate of exploitation of their workers. At the same time, European workers were gaining increasing mastery over the means of production in the factories and mines, and they were learning to work collectively in big enterprises and within their own trade union structures. If the bourgeoisie continued to deprive them of the major part of the fruits of their own labor and to oppress them socially and politically, then those two classes were set on a collision path. Ever since the mid-19th century, Marx had predicted class collision would come in the form of revolution, in which workers would emerge victoriously. The capitalists were terribly afraid of that possibility, knowing full and well that they themselves had seized power from the feudal landlords class by means of revolution. However, imperialism introduced a new factor into this situation, one that deferred the confrontation between workers and the capitalists in the metropoles. Only in Russia was there a workers' revolution. Russia was on the fringe of Europe rather than being one of its metropolitan capitalist centers. That very fact highlighted how much capitalism is placed like Britain, France, and Germany had been stabilized by exploiting the colonies and other semi-colonies such as Latin America, where states were independent in name only. Surplus from Africa was partly used to offer a few more benefits to European workers and served as a bribe to make the latter less revolutionary. The bribe came in the form of increased wages, better work conditions, expanded social services, and the benefits of colonialism were diffused throughout European society in many ways. Again, Africans and the continent developing Europeans and giving them their status quo and their oh my gosh. Most capitalist enterprises offer consumer goods which were mass produced at lower prices and therefore the European housewife got some relief. For instance, instant coffee brought new beverage within the reach of the ordinary worker. Meanwhile, the capitalist still made his fortune by ensuring that the Ivory Coast or Colombia growers got no price increase. In that way, colonialism was serving all classes and sectors of Western Europe and other capitalist metropoles. Let me reread that again. In that way, colonialism was serving all classes and sectors in Western Europe and other capitalist metropoles. European workers were paid a greater price for a few material benefits which accrued to them as crumbs from the colonial table. The class in power controls the dissemination of information. The capitalist information and miseducated workers in the metropoles to the point that they became allies in colonial exploitation, in accepting to be led by like sheep. European workers were perpetuating their own enslavement to the capitalists. They ceased to seek political power and contented themselves with bargaining for small wage increases, which were usually counterbalanced by increased cost of living. They ceased to be creative and allowed bourgeois culture decadence to overtake them all. They failed to exercise any independent judgment on the great issues of war and peace, and therefore ended up by slaughtering not only colonial peoples but also themselves. Fascism was a monster born of capitalist parents. Fascism came as the end product of the centuries of capitalist bestiality, exploitation, domination, and racism, mainly exercised outside Europe. It is highly significant that many settlers and colonial officials displayed a leaning towards fascism. Apartheid in South Africa is nothing but fascism. It was gaining roots from the early period of white colonization in the 17th centuries, and particularly after the mining industry brought South Africa fully into a capitalist orbit in the 19th century. Another example of the fascist potential of colonialism was seen when France was overrun by Nazi Germany in 1940. The French fascists collaborated with Schmittler to establish what was called the Vichy regime in France, and the French white settlers in Africa supported the Vichy regime. And a more striking instance to the same effect was the fascist ideology developed by the white settlers in Algeria, who not only imposed independence of Algeria under Algerian rule, but they also strove to bring down the more progressive of liberal governments of the metropolitan France. Inside Europe itself, some specific and highly revealing connections can be found between colonialist behavior and the destruction of a few contributions made by capitalism to human development. For instance, when Colonel von Lettow returned from leading the German forces in East Africa in World War I, he was promoted to a general in the German army, and von Lettow was in command of the massacre of the German communists in Hamburg in 1918. That was a decisive turning point in German history. For once, the most progressive workers had been crushed. The path was clear for the fascist deformation of the future. The brutally suppressing the Maji War in Tanganyika and an attempting genocide against the Herero people in Namibia, Southwest Africa. The German ruling class were getting the experience which they later applied against the Jewish people and against German workers and progressives. When the fascist dictatorship was inaugurated in Portugal in 1926, it drew inspirations for Portugal's colonial past. After Salazar became the dictator in 1932, he stated that his, quote, new state, end quote, in Portugal would be based on the labor of the, quote, inferior peoples, end quote, meaning, of course, Africans. In addition, Portuguese peasants and workers had to submit to police terror, poverty, and dehumanization. So they paid, and are still paying, a high price for fascism at home and colonialism abroad. Colonialism strengthened the Western European ruling class and capitalism as a whole, particularly in its later phases. It was evidently giving a new lease on life to the mode of production that was otherwise dying. From every viewpoint other than that of the minority class of the capitalists, colonialism was a monstrous institution holding back the liberation of man. What are we doing? I don't know. I'm just now looking. What's going on? I don't know. You're welcome, Lenny Pilled. Okay, no lag. I don't know what. Do we say something? I don't know. What do you mean? All right, here we go. Next chapter. Chapter 6. Colonialism as a system of underdevelopment in Africa. Doing pretty good on time. Hopefully I'll have some stopping points. All right, let's see here. The black man certainly has to pay dear for carrying the white man's burden. George Padmore, West Indian, Caribbean, Pan-Africanist, 1936. In the colonial society, education is such that it serves the colonialist. In a regime of slavery, education is but one institution for forming slaves. Statements of Frelimo, Mozambique Liberation Front, Department of Education and Culture, 1968. Hold on a second. My nose is running. I don't know why it runs all the time. It's weird. All right, here we go. Support benefits for colonialism to Africa. Supposed benefits of colonialism to Africa. Socioeconomic services. Faced with the evidence of European exploitation in Africa, many bourgeoisie writers would concede, at least partially, that colonialism was a system which functioned well in the interest of the metropoles. However, they would then urge that another issue to be resolved is how much Europeans did for Africans, and that it is necessary to draw up the balance sheet of colonialism. In that balance sheet, they place both the credits and the debits, and quite often conclude that the good outweighed the bad. The practical conclusion can quite easily be challenged by attention, but attention should also be drawn to the fact that the process of reasoning is itself misleading. The reasoning has some sentimental pervasiveness. It appeals to the common sentiment that, quote, after all, there must be two skies to a thing, end quote. The argument suggests that on the one hand there was exploitation and oppression, but on the other hand colonial governments did much for the benefit of Africans, and they developed Africa. It is our contention that this is completely false. Colonialism only had one hand. It was the one-handed bandit. It was the one-armed bandit. Sorry. What did I need to slow down. What did colonial governments do in the interest of Africans? Supposedly they built railroads, schools, hospitals, and the like. The sum total of these services was amazingly small. For the first 3 decades of colonialism, hardly anything was done that could remotely be termed a service to the African people. It was in fact only after the last war that social service were built as a matter of policy. How little they amounted to does not really need illustrating. After all, the statistics which show that Africa today is underdeveloped are the statistics representing the state of affairs at the end of colonialism. For that matter, the figures at the end of the first decade of African independence in the spheres such as health, housing, and education are often several times higher than the figures inherited by the newly independent governments. It would be an act of the most brazen fraud to weigh the paltry social enmities provided during the colonial epochs against the exploitation, and to arrive at the conclusion that the good outweighed the bad. Capitalism did bring social services to European workers, firstly as a byproduct of providing such services for the bourgeoisie and the middle class, and later as a deliberate act of policy. Nothing remotely comparable occurred in Africa. In 1934, long before the coming of the welfare state to Britain, expenditures of social services in British Isles amounted to £6.15 per person. In Ghana, the figure was 7 shillings 4 pence per person, and that was was high by colonial standards. In Nigeria and Nyasaland, it was less than 1 shilling 9 pence per head. None of the other colonizing powers were doing any better, and some much worse. The Portuguese stand out because they boasted the most and did the least. Portugal boasted that Angola, Guinea, and Mozambique have been their possessions for 500 years, during which time a, quote, civilized mission, quote unquote, has been going on. At the end of the 500 years of shouldering the white man's burden of civilizing, quote unquote, African natives, the Portuguese had not managed to train a single African doctor in Mozambique, and the life expectancy in eastern Angola was less than 30 years. As for Guinea-Bissau, some insight into the situation there is provided by the admission of the Portuguese themselves that Guinea-Bissau was more neglected than Angola and Mozambique. Furthermore, the limited social services within Africa during colonial times were distributed in a manner that reflected the patterns of domination of exploitation. First of all, white settlers and expatriates wanted the standards of the bourgeoisie or professional classes of the metropoles. They were all the more determined to have luxury in Africa because so many of them came from poverty in Europe and could not expect goods and services in their own homelands in colonies like Algeria, Kenya, and South Africa. It is well known that whites created the infrastructure to afford themselves leisure and enjoyable lives. It means, therefore, that the total enmities provided in any of those colonies is no guide to what Africans got out of colonialism. In Algeria, the figure for infant mortality was 39 per 1,000 live births among white settlers, but it jumped to 170 per 1,000 live births in the case of Algerians living in the towns. In practical terms, that meant that the medical, maternity, and sanitation services were all geared towards the well-being of the settlers. Similarly, in South Africa, all social statistics have to be broken down into at least two groups, white and black. If they are to be interpreted correctly, in British East Africa, there were 3 groups. Firstly, the Europeans, who got the most. Then the Indians, which was from India, who took most of what was left. And thirdly, the Africans, who came last in their own country. I'm going to make sure I didn't miss anything real quick. Yeah. In predominantly black countries, it was also true that the bulk of the social services went to whites. The southern part of Nigeria was one of the colonial areas that was supposed to have received the most from the benevolent mother country. Ibadan, one of the most heavily populated cities in Africa, had about 50 Europeans before the last war. For those chosen few, the British colonial government maintained the segregated hospital services of 11 beds and well-furnished surroundings. There were 34 beds for the 500,000 black people. The situation was repeated in other areas, so that altogether the 4,000 Europeans in the country in the 1930s had 12 modern hospitals, while the African population of at least 40 million had 52 hospitals. Jesus. The viciousness of the colonial system with respect to the provisions of social services was also dramatically brought out in the case of economic activities which made huge profits and notable in the mining industry. mining takes serious toll on the health of workers, and it was only recently that the metropoles that miners have had access to the kind of medical and insurance services which could safeguard their lives and health. In colonial Africa, the exploitation of miners was entirely without responsibility. In the 1930s, scurvy and other epidemics broke out in Lupa goldfield in Tanganyika. Hundreds of workers have died. One should not wonder that they had no facilities which would have saved some lives, because in the first place they were not being paid enough to eat properly. South Africa's large working class African population was in the sad state. The Tuberculosis Commission in 1912 reported that in the shanty towns, scarcely a single family existed in which at least one member is not suffering or dying from tuberculosis. Hospital services are so inadequate that incurable tuberculosis and other cases are simply sent home to die. The spread of infections and spread the infection. In some areas, a single doctor has to attend to the needs of 40,000 people. The natives must pay for medical treatment. There is no provision for pauper patients. About 65% of the native children die before reaching 2 years. That was as early as 1912, when the basis of the South African gold and diamond empire was already laid. After this, the shanty towns increased, the slum conditions grew worse, and the government committed itself to pursuing an arduous policy of apartheid, which meant separation of the races so as better to exploit the African people. Many Africans trekked to towns because, bad as they were, they offered a little more than the countryside. Modern sanitations, electricity, piped water, and schools were as foreign at the end of the colonial period as they were in the beginning. As far as most of rural Africa was concerned. Yet, it was the countryside that grew the cash crops and provided the labor that kept the system going. The peasants knew very little of the supposed, quote, credit on the colonial balance sheet, because even the scanty social services were meant only to facilitate exploitation. They were not given to any Africans whose labor was not directly producing surplus for export to the metropoles. That is to say, none of the wealth of exploited Africans could be deployed for the assistance of their brothers outside of the money economy. Multiple examples exist in substantiated the above proportions. The most quote-unquote wealthy colonies received greater social services under colonialism. Thus, the Rand of South Africa and Katanga in Congo had to provide for their relatively large working class. For many years, they approached the whole matter indifferently, but the final analysis, enlightened self-interest, made the colonialists realize that more African worker who maintained basic health and who had some degrees of literacy in industrial context. This was the same line of reasoning which had previously led the capitalist class in Europe to be somewhat freer in allowing part of the workers' productions to go back to keeping the workers alive and well. So basically, they're like, hey, we need to make sure that our workers are barely maintained to be able to produce for us. In the cash crop producing countries of Africa, a similar situation exists. whereby the tendency was for social economic services to decrease in colonies or areas which produce few goods to be shipped abroad. That accounts for the fact that Africans on the Gold Coast, Uganda, and Nigeria could be considered to having been, quote, better off, end quote, than those in Dahomey and Tanganyika and Chad. Within individual countries, considerable regional variations existed, depending on the degree to which different parts of the country were integrated into the capitalist money economy. Thus, the northern parts of Kenya or the south of Sudan had little to offer the colonialist, and such a zone was simply ignored by the colonizing power with regards to roads, schools, hospitals, and so on, often at the level of the district of the given colony, where there would be discrimination in providing social amenities on the basis of contribution to importable surplus. So that's the thing. In socialism, when you do these things, you're going to receive those things. In capitalism, you receive as less as possible for the amount of work you do. Socialism and labor is going to be differently defined underneath socialism. Some of the labor that doesn't even that capitalism doesn't recognize or doesn't even give any credence to are the labors that will probably like for instance reproduction labor, household labor, rearing children labor type things, for instance, plantations and companies sought to build hospitals for their workers because some minimum maintenance vicinity under subsistence conditions outside of the money economy were ignored altogether. The Ashura Declaration powerfully and simply expressed one of the deepest truths of the colonial experience in Africa when it stated, quote, "We have been oppressed a great deal, and we have been exploited a great deal, and we have been discarded a great deal," end quote. The combination of being oppressed, being exploited, and being disregarded is best illustrated by the patterns of the economic infrastructures of African colonies, notably their roads and railways. These have a clear geographical distribution, according to the extent of which particular regions needed to be opened up to import-export activities. Their exports were not available. Roads and railways had no place. The only slight exceptions is that certain roads and railways were built to move troops and make conquest and oppression easier. Means the communications were not constructed in the colonial period so that Africans could visit their friends. More important still, they were not laid down to facilitate internal trade in African commodities. There were no roads connecting different colonies and different parts of the same colony in the manner that made sense with regards to Africa's needs and development. All roads and railways led down to the sea. They were built to extract gold and manganese, or coffee or cotton. They were built to make businesses possible for timber companies, trading companies, and agriculture concession firms, and for white settlers. So they made all these things to benefit settlers, the metropoles, and to get all these products out quicker. Any catering to African interests was purely coincidental. Yet, in Africa, labor rather than capital took the lion's share in getting things done. With the minimum investment of capital, the colonial powers could mobilize thousands upon thousands of workers. Salaries were paid to the police officers and officials, and labor came into existence because of the colonial laws. The threat of force and the use of force take, for instance, into existence because of the colonial laws. The threat of force and the use of force take, for instance, the building of railways. In Europe and America, railways building required huge inputs of capital. Great wage builds were incurred during construction, and added bonus payments were made to workers to get the job done as quickly as possible. In most parts of Africa, the Europeans who wanted to see the railroad built offered lashes as an ordinary wage and more lashes for extra effort. Reference was earlier made to the great cost of African life of the French Congo Railway in Brazzaville to Point Nori. Most of the intolerable conditions were explained by the non-availability of capital in the form to Point Nori. Most of the intolerable conditions were explained by the non-availability of capital in the form of equipment. Therefore, sheer manpower had to take the place of earth-moving machinery, cranes, and so on. A comparable situation was provided by the construction of Mbarkis Airport of Nairobi, because it was built during the colonial era, starting in 1953, and with United States loans, it was customary to credit the imperialists for its existence. It would be much more accurate to say that the people of Kenya built it with their own hands under European supervision. Mbarkasi, which initially covered 7 square miles and had 4 runways, was described as, quote, the world's first handmade international airport. Mau Mau suspects numbering several thousands were to be found there, quote, laboring under armed guard at 1,000,000-ton excavation jobs, filling in craters, laying in 500,000 tons of stone, with nothing but shovels, stone, hammers, and their bare hands. The financial institutions of colonial Africa were even more scandalously neglectful to indigenous African interests than was in the case with the European-oriented communication system. The banks did very little lending locally. In British East Africa, credit to Africans was specifically discouraged by the credit to natives restriction ordinances in 1931. Insurance companies catered almost exclusively to the interests of white settlers and capitalist firms. The policies of colonial reserves in metropolitan currencies can also be cited as a, quote, service inimical to Africans. The currency boards and central banks which performed such services denied Africa access to its own funds created by exports. Instead of the colonial reserves in Britain, France, and Belgium represented African loans to the capitalist investment in Europe. It is necessary to re-evaluate the much glorified notion of, quote, European capital as having been invested in colonial Africa and Asia. The money available for investment in the capitalist system was itself a consequence of the previous robbery of workers and peasants in Europe and the world at large. In Africa's case, the capital that was invested in the 19th century commerce was part of the capital that had been derived from the trade in slaves. Portuguese government was the first in Europe to ship captives from Africa, and at least to let go of slave trading. Much of the profit slipped out of Portuguese hand and went instead into Britain and Germany, but the Portuguese slave trade nevertheless helped the Portuguese themselves to finance later colonial ventures, such as joint capitalist participation in agriculture and mining companies in Angola and Mozambique. Where we at? Come on, help me get it to a stopping point. Okay. It is indicated earlier Many of the entrepreneurs from the big European port towns who turned to the importing African agriculture produced into Europe were formerly carrying on the trade in slaves. The same can be said of many New England firms in the United States. Some of the biggest quote-unquote names in the colonial epoch were capitalist concern whose original capital came from the trade in slaves and from slavery itself. Lloyd's, the greatest insurance, underwriting, and banking houses, falls into this category, having been nourished by profits from the slave territories of the West Indies in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the ubiquitous Barclays Bank had its antecedents in slave trading. Worms et Company is a French example of the same phenomenon. Back in the 18th centuries, Worms had strong links with the French slave trade, and it grew to become one of the most Worms had strong links with the French slave trade, and it grew to become one of the most powerful financial houses dealing with the French Empire in Africa and Asia, in particular concentration on Madagascar and the Indian Ocean. The examples of Unilever and the UAC, which was highlighted in the previous chapters, also reinforced the point that Africa was being exploited by capital produced out of African labor. The Lever brothers took over the Niger Company in 1929. They became heirs to one of the most notorious exploiters in the 19th century Africa. The Niger Company was a chartered company with full governmental and police powers during the years 1885 to 1897. In that period, the company exploited Nigerians ruthlessly. Furthermore, the Niger Company was itself a monopoly that had bought up smaller firms tracing their capital directly to slave trading. Similarly, when the UAC was born out of the merger with the Eastern and African trade companies, it was associated with some more capital that grew from the family tree rooted in European slave trade. The capital at the disposal of the big French trading firms of CFAO and SCOA can also be traced in the same way. I'm gonna look ahead real quick, everybody. Oh my gosh. It doesn't look good. I hate finding stopping points because I'm never good at finding stopping points. All right. The process of capital accumulation and reproduction in East Africa lacked the continuity of West Africa. Firstly, Arabic people, as well as Europeans, were participants in the slave trade from East Africa. Secondly, the Germans intervened in 1885, although they have not been previously involved, while the French, who had led the European slave trade in East Africa during the 18th and 19th centuries, concentrated on colonizing the Indian Ocean islands rather than the East African mainland. Thirdly, German colonialism did not last beyond 1914 to 1918 war. Even so, on the British side, the capital and profits of the colonized East African Company reappeared in the trading firm of Smith Mackenzie. Bro, mad Zimbabwe proves his ideology doesn't work. What the fuck? What are we talking about? Aren't they getting their land back from white people? Isn't that like the whole deal? To get your land back from white people in Zimbabwe? Because white people stole the land. The capital that was invested in colonial Africa in later years was the continuation of the 19th century, along with new influx from the metropole. If one inquired closely into the origins of the supposedly new resources, quite a few would have been connected very closely to previous exploitation and non-European peoples. However, it is not necessary to prove that every firm trade in Africa had a first-hand or a second-hand connection with European slave trade and with earlier exploitation of the continent. It is enough to remember that Europe's greatest source of primary capital accumulation was overseas, and that the profit from African ventures continually outran the capital investments in the colonies. The conservative bourgeoisie writers on colonial Africa made a following remark about South African gold and diamonds industries. And here's what this person said. Land back, now begging for them back. Oh my gosh, shut the hell up. We're not going to beg, we're going to take and seize. There's no begging, it's destruction and destroying to get the land back. He's like how they did it. Apart from the original capital subscribed in the diamond, he's like how they did it. Apart from the original capital subscribed in the diamond industry, all capital expenditure was provided for out of profits. The industry also yielded large profits into international firms, which dealt in diamonds. These had a peculiar importance because a considerable portion of the wealth accumulated by diamond firms was later used in the development of the gold industry of the Rand. That is not what they're, oh my God. Bro like has to laugh every single time. Bro's like laughing. It's funny. It's kind of funny. Similarly, in Angola and the it's a diamond company, was an investment that quickly paid for itself and was then producing capital. The combined profits of that company for the years 1954 to 1955 along came to the total of invested capital plus 40%. The excess over investments and the maintenance cost was, of course, expatriated to Portugal, Belgium, and the United States, where the shareholders of that diamond company were resident, and Angola was thereby investing in those countries. In this sense, the colonies were the generators of the capital rather than the countries into which foreign capital was plowed. Capital was constantly in motion from metropole to some part of the dependencies, from colonies to other colonies via the metropoles, from one metropole to another, and from colony to the metropole. But because of the super profits created by non-European peoples ever since slavery, the net flow was from colony to metropole. That was called, quote, profits, end quote. In one year came back as, quote, capital the next. Even progressive writers have created a wrong impression by speaking about capital, quote, exports, end quote, from Europe to Africa, and about the rule of, quote, foreign, end quote, capital. That was foreign about what was foreign about the capital in the colonial Africa was its ownership and not its initial source. Apologists for colonialism are quick to say that the money for schools, hospitals, and such services in Africa was provided by the British, French, and Belgian taxpayers, as the case may have been. It defies logic to admit that profits from a given colony in a given year totaled several $1 million, and to affirm, nevertheless, that the few $1,000s allocated to social services in that colony was the money of European taxpayers. The true situation can accurately be presented in the following terms. African workers and peasants produced for European capitalism goods and services of a certain value. A small proportion of the fruits of their efforts was retained by them in the form of wages, cash payments, extremely limited social services, such as were essential to the maintenance of colonialism. The rest went to the various beneficiaries of the colonial system. There can be little dispute over the credibility of the data, which are available to amply demonstrate that colonialism, for the most part, aimed at developing the metropoles and only allowed certain crumbs to the colonies as incidental byproducts of exploitation. British colonial records are full of reports of royal commissions investing this and that. The reports upon which action was seldom taken, providing the best evidence of the appalling differences of the colonial regime to the needs of Africans. In the 1930s, there were riots throughout the West Indies because of the unsupportable suffering of the African descendants who were left stranded in those parts alter slavery. The royal commissions investing the grievances found them so shocking that the full findings were not published during the war, lest they reveal that colonialism was hardly any better than fascism against which Britain was fighting. It was out of that investigation that the idea of establishing colonial development and welfare (CD&W) was advanced. An act to the effect was passed in 1940, although it was not until 1944 that the funds became available to CD&W loans to colonial administrations. The French also had counterparts of CD&W in forms of FIDES, set up in 1946. From the earliest days of colonial expansion, there were two kinds of explanations of motives coming out of the metropoles. One was very frank and appealed to the various chambers of commerce in European towns. It said simply that Europeans were in the colonial game because it was damned profitable, and that was that. However, there were other elements who thought it necessary to peddle a line about welfare of the quote-unquote uncivilized natives. This was a continuation of earlier justification of slavery on the grounds that it carried the Africans to Christian lands. As colonialism came under heavy criticism during the last decades, more deliberate efforts were made to whitewash it. Both CD&W and FIDES were part of the public relations propaganda of colonialism, striving to mask and deny this viciousness. Above all, both FIDES and CD&W were born of post-war conditions in Europe at the time when Western Europeans, capitalist nations, were desperately falling back on the colonies to save them vis-a-vis socialism and even from the competition of the United States. Mr. Bevan, a noted labor leader turned traitor to his class and spokesman of British capitalism, made the observation that, quote, the other two world powers, the United States and the Soviet Russia, have tremendous resources. If Western Europe is to achieve its balance of payments and to get the world equilibrium, it is essential that African resources should be developed and made available. End quote. Any close study of the operations of CD&W and FIDES reveals clearly that they had nothing to do with African development, but a great deal to do with the welfare of capitalist Europe. Okay. Where we at? Let me see here. There's more of the I think I'm I might stop here. Yeah, we'll stop here. Page 257. 257. So again, he's driving the point of the development of Europe. And even after the Great Wars, still the intensification of exploitation in the colonies brought Europe out of depression, out of financial economic crises, out of both the wars and everything. Africa fueled the development of Europe, and Europe did not do anything to develop until nothing, barely anything. And those companies that we were just talking about did nothing to help develop those things either. They did nothing, you know? But let's see where we're gonna get to. Let me look ahead. So again, Western society utilizing the global South in order for its adventures and to be able to be highly developed and to gain super profits and stuff. Bro, no they were not. No they were not. Jesus Christ. I guess someone doesn't even know what neocolonialism is. Negative characters of social, political, and economic consequences. Talking about, they're still doing fucking exploitation of the global South. What are you talking about, dude? Talking about, dude? That's a big one. Education and underdevelopment. Ooh, that's gonna be a good one. It's a long, yeah, this is a long chapter. This might be the last chapter, who knows? I'm trying to get to this into this chapter. Oh my God. Look at this fucking fash. You're a fash, dude. Why are you a fash? Goddamn. Fascist motherfucker, dude. Jesus Christ. So is this dude. Oh, don't worry. I'm just gonna do this to that dude. So what I'm gonna do to them. I'm gonna just do that. That's better. Alright, I just muted them. No big deal. I'm looking ahead. Damn, this chapter is long as fuck. Hold on a second. This gotta be the last chapter. Yeah, I just muted them. Fuck them. Sooner or later, it's gonna be China. I'm trying to find to see what the next chapter is, but I think this is the last chapter. It's just a fucking huge chapter too. Damn, that's a long ass chapter. Yep, postscript. I don't know if I should read the postscript. All right, I think that's it, everybody. This book is wonderful. We'll get into more, and we can see how the underdevelopments are happening. What's going on here? All right, everybody, I'm going to close it out for the night. Thank you for being here. If you did stay, I appreciate it, and wish you are happening. What's going on here?